Hello, good day everyone. Welcome to this video's another important lesson that we are going to share for you in today's lesson. So, just sit back, relax, enjoy, and spend some moment of science with Sir Rabino. Well, we will start this lesson by sharing one of the things that I enjoy the most, which is, of course, um, looking and watching some memes on the internet. Well, don't get me wrong, I only check out those memes that are fun and at the same time educational. So while I was browsing on the internet, I somewhat caught my attention to the following memes that I searched from the internet. So I will start my sharing from by this. So let's try to check this meme number one. Okay. I hope you recognize this meme. It's just edited a little bit. So Philippines exist and tectonic plates. So what happened to the tectonic plates? Somewhat it's dancing, right? So look at that face. It's so hilarious. There. And let's have the second meme that one of my favorite meme also. There. We have Philippines at the center, we have earthquakes, and then we have volcanic eruption. And somewhat the two phenomena are somewhat laughing to the Philippines, right? And although this meme somewhat looks hilarious at the same time, very funny, it actually reveals a lot of meaning. Number one, if you're going to check out the first meme, simply tells us that the Philippines location is somewhat situated ideally where tectonic plates are actually very active. And we know for the fact that Philippines is one of the few countries that belong to the so-called Pacific Ring of Fire, where most of these earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are happening. So with this, what's the implication? Since we are somewhat part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, we constantly experience this natural geologic phenomena like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. And we cannot avoid the fact that sometimes we experience disasters like what you are seeing right now in your pictures. Could cause destruction to our houses, to buildings, to infrastructures, and as well as loss of lives and properties of the people. So that is why it is important for us to be aware and to somewhat be knowledgeable about the different types of hazards that these natural geologic disasters could pose to our lives and as well as our properties. So that is why for this lesson, we are going to talk about the different earthquake hazards that could prove somewhat disastrous at the same time, would cause loss of lives as well as our properties. So, I will try to target the following objectives of this lesson. So, first, we are going to describe the different kinds of hazard that could result from an earthquake. And also, we will differentiate hazards from risk, which is very important. And we will discuss the possible earthquake hazards that and as well as the risk of the community where you belong. Yes. It is tantamount and it's very important that you know the different hazards that could occur in your community as well as its accompanied risk to the community where you belong, especially that we belong to the region of the Pacific Ring of Fire. So let us now start our lesson by somewhat digging in from our past. Why is it that knowledge about earthquake hazards so important? Well, if you're going to look at the history of our country, we are frequently visited by these natural geologic disasters. Like for example, the one that happened during 1990, the 1990 Luzon earthquake, which of course somewhat proved to be devastating on the lives of the Filipino people living in that area. So, what happened during that calamity? Well, as you can see in the picture, that is so devastating, right? Well, it's because prolonged shaking of the ground caused by the surface waves can result in damage to many structures that cannot withstand such violent motion. And FYI, earthquake related deaths are primarily caused by collapsing buildings like the one that you are seeing right now in your picture. And while this is just one aspect of the seismic activities, earthquake hazards include any physical phenomenon associated with an earthquake that may produce adverse effects not just to the lives but also to the properties of the people. And of course, it could also produce adverse effects on our human activities. So that is why let's start first by asking this question: hazards versus risks. What's the difference? So surely you would tell me that, well, they are just synonymous. Well, of course, reality wise, yeah, they are synonymous, but in fact, these two terms are quite different if you're going to check them meticulously. Now let's try to identify what's the difference between these two. So first, let's go with hazards. When you talk about hazards, these are any natural phenomena that might impact a region, regardless whether there is anyone around to experience these hazards. So, meaning to say, these are natural phenomena. So, you try to reflect what could be the possible hazard that could happen in the event that there will be an earthquake. Try to think. Yeah. Well, I will leave that one for our discussion later. But I know for sure that you have already some answers in your mind. So, let's move on first to our next definition of terms. So, what is risk then? So, when you speak about risks, this is what people will stand to lose, or it is what people or what a person have built in that is threatened here. And usually, when you speak about risks, risk is usually measured in terms of the amount of damage or fatalities, like the one that you see in the news. And whereas hazard is generally measured in more physical terms, like for example, strength, the shaking energy, or shall we say, the magnitude of the earthquake. So this is how these two would differ in terms of how they are measured, and of course, and how we identify them individually. So knowing this difference between the two would somewhat help us understand more about the possible hazards that could happen in an event of a natural geologic disaster, along with its accompanying risks. So, let's try to identify some of these right now. So, what are some of the common earthquake hazards that could happen in the event that this earthquake will strike an area? So, let's start with the very obvious one. Of course, number one, ground motion. So, ground motion or ground shaking, they are synonymous. So, what does ground motion somewhat have to do with this? So, ground shaking or ground motion will vary over an area, and it could depend on some factors, like, for example, the topographic feature of an area, or what are the land features that are present in the area. Are there fault lines, or shall we say, are there active fault zones in the area that would somewhat help you understand the shaking motion of the ground in the event that there will be an earthquake that will happen? Or it could be the bedrock type of the crust itself, or shall we say the orientation of the fracture or the fault in the area, whether if it is a deep slip or a strike slip fault, because the difference of these topographic features could pose different effects also, and how the ground shaking will affect the crust as well as the structures and the buildings that are built into it. And the damage that is produced by ground shaking is directly proportional to the strength of the structures involved. So, meaning to say that if an earthquake generates a large vibration intensity, let's say around magnitude 6 or magnitude 7, so God forbid it will not happen to us, so then expect that buildings, bridges, and dams could be severely damaged. So, that is one aspect of how ground motion as a hazard could pose risk in our community. So, let's talk about another type of hazard. Number two, land and soil failure. Well, aside from the damage of the artificial structures, earthquakes can also wreak havoc on Earth itself. Like, for example, landslides. For instance, it poses a major geologic hazard that may include large scale movements such as rock falls, deep failure of the slopes, just like what you are seeing right now in the picture, and shallow debris fall. And of course, landslide could prove also very fatal, especially if you are living an area which is highly elevated and, shall we say, an area with a steep slope. Because in the event of an earthquake, especially if the soil somewhat has a very low integrity, could easily be eroded in the process. So this could prove very fatal in the lives and properties also of the people living in the area or living near the area where it is landslide prone. So another effect also of land and soil failure is sometimes we might experience or this feature might occur. So we call this one as a fault scarp. So how does a fault scarp produce? So fault movements that are associated with earthquakes can also produce areas of great vertical offset, meaning to say an offset, meaning meaning um, this is how a fault scarp is produced. These things happen when there is a vertical movement. Take note of this. When there is a vertical movement or a deep slip fault during an earthquake, or as a result here, a scarp or a vertical offset is completely exposed in this case. So that example there is from Texas Hill Country, USA. So it's a very very obvious fault scarp. So that is one of the effect of land and soil failure. And at the same time also, soil liquefaction could also happen, especially in an area or a place when loosely packed waterlogged sediment at or near the ground surface will lose their strength in response to strong ground shaking. So as a result, what happens here is that soil somewhat behaves like a liquid, so or like a fluid. So I would like to discuss this in detail. So in areas, what happens during soil liquefaction? In areas with fluid saturated sand, the strength and the stiffness of the soil is greatly reduced by the seismic vibrations. So we expect that during vibrations, the water pressure could also rise up, and as a result, the water from the bedrock, let's say for example, will somewhat shoot itself upward, and when that happens, these water particles will be absorbed by the individual soil particles, and the space between these individual particles will be completely filled with water. So that's why when this happens, the soil loses its integrity, and this could be disastrous because a soil liquefaction could be very dangerous in the sense that it could swallow cars, it could also swallow buildings. Hmm, that could happen. We don't know. Um, it could not only swallow cars, could swallow buildings, but of course it could destroy many infrastructure, especially in the areas where soil liquefaction is so prone and so common during an earthquake. Like for example, you can expect something like this, right? Looks so funny to watch, but believe me, If soil liquefaction happens, it is very disastrous. And of course, let's not forget about the most common hazard that could happen in the event of an earthquake, and that is your tsunami. In Japanese, it's literally translated as the harbor waves, but don't get this wrong, because tsunamis are very different from the normal ocean waves that you see every day or on a normal basis. So what is a tsunami then? Well, a tsunami is like this. Tsunami is a wave train or a series of waves, you have to take note of this, that is generated by the vertical motions of the sea, or a body of water that moves the whole water column. And these violent motions displace, okay, take note of this. The violent motion displays the entire column of water, overlying the fault, creating bulges and depressions in water. And as a result, the waves that are generated by tsunamis do not resemble ordinary water waves, because the wavelengths of the tsunamis are far longer compared to the normal waves. If you're going to check the ocean waves on normal basis, you will notice that the waves are just the wavelength of the ocean waves are somewhat shorter, right? But in tsunamis, it far stretches even in kilometers. So it's so long. So that's how you distinguish the two. And at the same time, also, tsunamis could also resemble a rapidly rising tide. And this is for this reason that they are often referred to erroneously as tidal waves. But in fact, they are not tidal waves. Okay? So please take that misconception away from you. And although the impact of the tsunamis is very limited to coastal areas, let's say if you're living near a coastal area, their destructive power can be enormous and they can affect the entire ocean basins. As a matter of fact, a tsunami wave's velocity can even travel faster than a Formula One racing car. And if you remember, history-wise, dating back to 2004, I think that was, if I remember correctly, that was in Indonesia, wherein the tsunami wave that was produced is equivalent to 23 atomic bombs. And eventually, when the tsunami struck the coastal area, it hits the 11 countries, no? Or yeah, 11 countries, and actually the total death toll during that time was around more than around 20,000 plus. I do not know the exact figure, but all I know was that it was 20,000 plus. So that was somewhat one of the devastating tsunamis that happened in history, along with the tsunami that happened in Japan in 2011, the 9.0 magnitude earthquake. And that's all for our discussion about the different earthquake hazards. There are still a lot of hazards that could happen, class. Okay? Believe me, these are not the only hazards that could happen in the event of an earthquake. In fact, there might even be other hazards that were not mentioned here that you can think of. So, but what is important here is that in the event of an earthquake, which is of course a hazard itself, it could also trigger different types of hazards that could pose somewhat danger and as well as disaster to the lives and the properties of the people living in the area. So that is why it is very important and it is very tantamount that in every disaster preparedness plan that you are going to come up with, you must know the different hazards as well as the risks that are accompanied with it, so that you will be knowledgeable on what are the things that you should do and that you should follow in the event that this geologic disaster will happen. And that is why, for this lesson, I would like to ask the following questions. So try to reflect on these questions. Number one, in the area where you lived in, what are the some common hazards to be expected in the event of an earthquake? And how about the risk? try to reflect on those matters. Second, why do you think it is important to know the different hazards and risks of an area in the event of an earthquake? Right? Why is it important? And last but not the least, knowing these different earthquake risks and hazards in your community, what can be done in order for you to minimize the effects brought by this natural disaster? So try to ask that yourself. And I want to hear your thoughts as well as your answers by posting some comments in the video below. So just post your comments or just place your answers. Try to answer them as a way of practicing your knowledge as well as your awareness of the risk and hazards brought upon by this natural disaster. And with this, I would like to end my lesson from here. And before I end my lesson, I would like to share a very important quote or a very important, shall we say, um, quote that I created myself. So let's try to check it right now. Knowing these hazards and risks will help us prepare best in the event of any natural disaster like an earthquake. Because after all, ligtas ang may alam. Diba? Because we are safe if we are more knowledgeable about these things. And that is why I'm going to end my lesson from here. So it has been a great time and it has been fun being with you throughout this lesson. And I hope that you have learned something out from our discussion for today. So once again, thank you for sharing some moment of science with me, Sir Rabino. So this is Sir Rabino signing off. Thank you and God bless you all.